Hello, my friends. This is Andy Falco Show coming to you live from Orange County, California. And I've been wanting to do this show ever since the incident there in Uvalde, Texas. But things changed seemingly every day. If not, they did change every day, if not every hour on the hour, as more news came out and different spokespeople got in front of the camera, whether it was, Border Patrol or a spokesperson for the police department or the mayor. I mean, it went on and on. And because of what appears to be some untruths or lies, misinformation, it became way more complicated. And so it became more difficult for me to be able to come on and talk about it. And I know there's some folks that have text me and message me in Messenger and said, "Hey, what's your take on this whole thing? And why didn't they go in right away? And what happened between the communication and all this kind of stuff?" And I gave some answers, privately to some people, but to be able to come on and do a show where quite possibly more people could see what it is that my opinion would be on this whole thing. Again, it became increasingly difficult because of the change of so many aspects of what happened in Uvalde. For those of you that normally don't watch anything that I produce or put out here on the internet, in social media, and if you've not followed some of the shows, and I got to apologize to those of you that do. I do have to go through a little bit of my background, only because if somebody's watching this for the first time, they may be wondering, well, what do you know about this stuff, and why do we care what your opinion is? And you may not care, but the reason that I do think that many people come to me is because number one, I'm formerly a police officer here in Southern California, and Police Department. 21 years, I was involved in not only teaching at the police academy at the Orange County Sheriff's Department and Golden West Academy, and others across the United States. I trained canine handlers and officers throughout the United States and North America, South America, and even some came from overseas, for me to teach and train about tactics, about how to use police dogs, how to testify in court, how to write a report on the whatever criminal activity that was involved, that later would then morph into where I would be asked to look at criminal cases and evaluate the activity and how officers handled certain crimes. And I continue to do that to this day. My experience goes all the way back to 1984 when I started in law enforcement, to today, where I'm still involved in investigating criminal cases, and on both the defense side of things and the prosecutor side of things, or the law enforcement side of things. And so my experience is fairly extensive in this area, both on the training side of things, on the supervisory side of things, and then again looking into what officers are doing in many police departments, hundreds and hundreds of police departments throughout North America. I've testified both in the United States and in Canada, and spent a lot of time investigating law enforcement. And I've seen a lot of things. I've taught law enforcement, like I said, across the United States and in Canada, and from big police departments to little tiny police departments of maybe 5 police officers, where the chief of police actually responds to calls, and lieutenants and captains, to LAPD, LA County Sheriff, New York PD, Chicago Police Department, Washington D.C. Police Department, you name it. I've probably trained one or more officers from most of the major police departments throughout the United States, and again, including smaller police departments. I investigated even Border Patrol on several cases involving arrest, and so that's my background. That is why people get a hold of me sometimes to look at what's happening in the world. Hello, April. Nice to see you. What I find concerning is that they want to demolish the school while so many questions are still unanswered. Oh my gosh, there's so much, April. The next disclaimer I want to give you is that although I'm very much pro law enforcement, as a matter of fact, I'm so pro law enforcement that I investigate law enforcement in order to help law enforcement do better. That is the reason why I got involved in even responding to phone calls from defense attorneys in relationship to what happened during the arrest of their client, and looking at tons of video. I would venture to say that I've watched hundreds of hours of car stops, of police pursuits, body cams, of tracking down suspects, to use of force, shootings and homicides, and the tracking down of bad guys that are hiding in the forest, to hiding inside buildings and that type of stuff. So I've looked at hundreds of videos, and the question that I get from mostly law enforcement officers is, if you like law enforcement, you support law enforcement, why are you talking to defense attorneys? It's because I love law enforcement and I want law enforcement to do the right thing. And I think that somebody that actually knows what they're talking about should be the one looking at those things. You shouldn't want somebody who hates law enforcement investigating law enforcement, because that's what's happening. And that's one of the things I'm going to get to as I look into why what happened in Uvalde happened. And I'm going to get to that, but it's much more complicated. And so as I begin the show, and I'm going to do my very best to not go like 2 hours. I'm going to keep this down, hopefully, to less than an hour. But it's multifaceted. The thing about what happened in Uvalde, many people want to have this one thought that it was a coward or several cowards that did not go in to save these children. That it's the chief of police's fault, that it's one dimensional. This isn't one dimensional. There is many facets to why what happened in Uvalde happened, and why what is happening in law enforcement right now is going to happen. In other words, things are going to occur where decisions are not made where you would expect somebody to make a decision to shoot, don't shoot, to go in, not to go in, to chase, not to chase. That things have rapidly changed in law enforcement, especially over the last 2 years, that has caused this to occur. And what happened in Uvalde is just a symptom of the bigger cancer that is plaguing law enforcement today. And I do believe that if things don't change, the demise of law enforcement is just around the corner. And I don't know what we're going to do. It is going to be a huge problem. From the beginning of time, we have needed law enforcement to keep a lid on our cities, on our communities, on just the smallest of communities to nations, to just as long as you can imagine, whether it's been military being used as law enforcement, or actually a law enforcement entity has always been needed to protect the innocent from the criminal. The criminal mind has been around since the beginning of time. The sinful man has been around since the beginning of time. What I found interesting today is that Gascon up in Los Angeles, the horrendous DA that's in Los Angeles, and there's more than just him. There's several in our country right now. That what he said is that that he couldn't predict, that you can't predict what will happen in a case where somebody that was arrested for a weapons violation or a violent crime, that you can't predict that they're going to, once they release, that they're going to do something bad. No, you can. That's how law enforcement operates. That is one of the main tools that we use, is to look at somebody's rap sheet to determine who it is we're going to be looking for. Because quite often, a person who has a criminal mind or a life of criminality will often return to a life of criminality. And this is not hard and not difficult. And it is just something that the left often does. And that is, they lie. And so he is lying when he tells you on a press conference that he could not have predicted that this suspect that just recently killed 2 law enforcement officers in El Monte, that he could not have predicted that something like that would have happened. No, we very easily can, because that is one of the tools that we use to begin an investigation about somebody. We immediately go to the people that we think may have committed the crime, and begin to look at their rap sheet, look at their history, look at their history of criminality. And we quite often will find that most felons who commit violent crimes have a history of committing crime, not just violent crime, but crime. So the first thing you need to know is that what happened in Uvalde is a multifaceted problem that is not a singular. You can't have singular thinking when you're looking at how are we going to avoid this in the future, and it's not guns. And that is not the one thing. There are gun issues that you need to look at, but it's in the guns in the criminal's hands is what we need to look at, not just simply guns. Outlawing guns is not the singular thing that's going to solve this kind of problem. It is the criminals with guns that we need to look at in relationship to the multifaceted problem that we have in regard to law enforcement. We have a mental health pandemic with kids it is being exacerbated, that was exacerbated with the pandemic, that also needs to look at. That we have issues in regard to social media and all those kinds of things. That's another facet that really needs to be looked at. And the demonization of law enforcement is the thing that I'm going to directly look at and kind of go through a history. My 30 years, my 3 decades or 30 years of being involved in law enforcement, that will kind of give you an idea how we ended up here at this place in time in regard to the history. And then the unwillingness of Democrats to hold criminals accountable. We'll look at that. And so I want to get started and not spend too much time on these things, but I know I need to go way back when I first started in law enforcement in 1984, and kind of give you an idea of where law enforcement was and what has happened over the last 3 decades that, again, has got us to this place. So first, I want to answer a question as to why do people become law enforcement officers? And, my history, my personal history was that, of course, watching Adam 12, knowing some police officers that I worked with when I was a bus driver that did the job and would share the stories of the job. And as they begin to tell the stories, as you begin to watch television shows like Adam 12 or Emergency or Dragnet, if you go way back, that's actually before my time, but I did watch the black and white versions later on, the reruns, is that it gives you an idea of that being involved in law enforcement is fun, and that you get to catch bad guys and arrest them and put them in jail. And if you have a more moral side of you and less sinful side of you, that is attractive, that you go, you know what, I want to help people. I want to make sure that while people are sleeping, they don't have to worry about what's happening around them, and they can sleep soundly knowing that they are safe and their children are safe, because people like law enforcement officers are out there awake and keeping them safe. And so catching and arresting bad guys and keeping people safe is clearly one of the reasons why many, if not most human beings on our planet get involved in law enforcement. The adrenaline rush is another thing. When you watch these television shows, you see them chasing bad guys, where they're running after them on foot or they're chasing them in a vehicle. That is exciting. It's an adrenaline rush when you're wrestling with somebody, fighting them, and your buddies are coming in there, and you're actually in combat, hand-to-hand combat with somebody. That adrenaline rush, strangely enough, to some people, is attractive and fun. You want to do something every day. That was one of the main things that attracted me to law enforcement, is that every day you have no idea what you're going to be involved in. You could be writing traffic tickets. You could be at a domestic violence. You could be rescuing a cat in a tree with the fire department, assist with their ladders. You could be, again, in a pursuit. You could be running after somebody. You can be involved in a shooting. You can be involved in a robbery, a car theft, auto theft, carjacking. You don't know. Every day is going to be just a little bit different. And that, for me, was one of the most attractive things of getting there. And then you could have a passion for something that you could also use in law enforcement. My passion happened to be animal training and being involved in animals. And of course, as many of you know, and some of you may not know, is that my history happens to be with police canines, and running a company for several decades, training police officers and their canines to find narcotics and to chase down bad guys and search for bad guys that are hiding in somebody's backyard or in their house or in a warehouse, was the thing that I was able to take a passion and apply it to law enforcement. So that made all the things that I got in law enforcement just that much better. The other thing, of course, is monetary, which is the benefits that you get, because when you're involved in government, there's quite a few benefits, whether it's a 401k or medical insurance. And in my case with canines, I got to take a car home, and just you name it, there's overtime, and the money actually is not that bad, especially in California. By the time I retired, I was making upwards to 80,000 to 100 something thousand dollars a year by the time that I retired from the police department. So the pay for me in California was not that bad. And then, of course, one thing that everybody knows about law enforcement officers is it's a great ego boost, right? You have a uniform, you get to order people around, you get to take away somebody's freedom, and you take them to jail, and it's a little bit of an ego boost, which for most men is a positive. And I'm not sure, I've never asked a woman about an ego boost, if that's one of the things that attracts them, but I probably should. It could be. I may have a female law enforcement officer watching right now, but if there is, let me know in the comments, if you would, as to what it is that attracted you to law enforcement, if any of those things ring true. So that's important for you to know, because as time goes on, as I go through the 30 years of history that I have with law enforcement, you'll see that these things of catching and arresting bad guys, the adrenaline rush, doing something different every day, that you're using to your passion to not only do the thing that you're passionate about, but you're using that passion to catch bad guys. And then you have your benefits and everything else. And the ego boost is really huge. The downside of law enforcement is the secretarial work that goes along with it. Many of us probably did not realize that when we got in law enforcement that we were going to be writing as many reports and filing reports and making copies of these reports, and the amount of paperwork and documentation, all that kind of stuff. Really, in the 80s was not as bad as it got to be in the 2000s, and that really became very difficult. So just on that thing, it's important to understand how the mind works when it comes to people who get involved in law enforcement. And it's kind of sad, and it's probably one of those things that you don't know. You may know, if you're married to a law enforcement officer, you probably heard this mention this from time to time, is that, I don't mind arresting bad guys, but the paperwork can really bring you down, and it makes it difficult. A DUI is probably one of the most burdensome arrests you can make, because the amount of paperwork that comes with a DUI, a driving under the influence arrest, is substantial. And when you arrest somebody, for at least a patrol officer, when you arrest somebody for driving under the influence, that you're going to be taken out of service. If you have a 12 and a half hour shift, which most law enforcement, anywhere with 10 to 12 and a half hour shift, that about 3 or 4 of those hours is going to be taken up with paperwork. And so what ends up happening in some cases is that could curtail your desire to go out and find people that are driving under the influence. Again, I'm not proud of this, and I'm going to tell you that this is a fact, that I know that some law enforcement officers hate it when I go to these places and talk about things that can put some police officers in a little bit of a negative light, but we're human beings. And what ends up happening is that you then begin to avoid those kinds of things. And so what will end up happening is that you will stop somebody that's under the influence, and then you will often make a phone call to have somebody come pick up that drunkard and take them away, or you'll put them in a taxi cab or an Uber and avoid the amount of documentation that goes along with it. And so sometimes the amount of paperwork can bring down, and this is important, I want you to understand how important this is, that these are the things that we can be affected by. Now, if we can be affected by the amount of documentation or amount of paperwork that puts in our lap because of an arrest, and it reduces the times that we will make sure that we will be out there proactively looking for that type of crime, if that affects our ability, or not our ability, but our desire to go out and find that crime, what does that do? It brings down the number of arrests for that type of crime, because we are not alone in this thought that if you have 300 police officers, or even let's say 15 police officers that are making decisions based on the amount of work behind making that arrest, and it gets reduced, now you're going to reduce the number of people that are arrested for that crime. I hope that makes sense to you. And if that affects us as law enforcement officers, the fact that we have to do a lot of paperwork, again, this is not something we're proud of, or I'm proud of, and even telling you about, that you can imagine what other things will affect our desire to go put our lives on the line or go out there and do the work. Imagine what the demonization of law enforcement will do. That if we go out and we make a mistake, or we do something to arrest somebody that hurts them, breaks their arm, causes them to be knocked out, or we have to shoot them, that if in the normal days, that would be looked at as, oh, that's what happens in law enforcement, that law enforcement enforcing the law sometimes is not pretty, that people get hurt, people get shot, people get injured when they are criminals. That used to be kind of like a given. But when you now move that over to a place where, oh, we're going to get, now not only when we arrest somebody, if we hurt them, now we're going to be investigated. Now we're going to get desk duty. Now everybody's going to look at us as if we're horrible people. We may even get suspended or fired. And in the worst case scenario, we might get arrested. Now what is that going to do to your work product? It's going to bring it down even further. If extra documentation and paperwork is going to bring down your desire to do the job, what do you think these other things are going to do to your desire to do the job? Just, it goes hand in hand. So the downside of law enforcement is we actually called ourselves sometimes secretaries with a handgun, or secretaries with a badge, because that was the negative side of things. So I hope you don't get too lost in that, but I want to make sure and bring that up, because that's really important to understand when I get down to the place, what happened in Uvalde. It wasn't about the paperwork, but it's about some other stuff that, and it's a culmination of a multifaceted problem. So here's my first tick mark, where a multifaceted problem is going to affect the decisions that were made in Uvalde. The testing process in the beginning, in the 1980s, when I tested, was a very difficult process. There's multi levels of testing to get in law enforcement. You have to fill out this very lengthy application to first even get started with law enforcement. It's several pages long. I don't know how long it is now, but I know it was 25 to 30 pages for an application. You know, when you go to Starbucks, maybe 2 or 3 pages. But for law enforcement, it's a whole bunch of stuff. You have to give so much information. You got to give information about at least you used to have to give information about your neighbors, about your relatives, about your work history, all as far back as you could possibly think, not just the last 2 jobs you had, but all the jobs you've had, what your supervisors' names were, what their phone numbers were, how do they contact them. I'm sure today they're probably asking for social media. They're asking for a whole bunch of stuff, but the application process is gigantic. Then once you turn that in, then you have a physical where you go out and run and you jump and you, at least you used to. Again, right now, I'm not sure exactly what it is they're doing, because that began to get watered down as time went on. But at the time when I was applying, we had to do a lot of running. You had to do a lot of push-ups. You had to drag a dummy that weighed 100-something pounds. You had to be able to jump over walls and crawl and do a whole bunch of stuff. The test was pretty extensive that we had to do. And then you have your background investigation, where you go meet with your background officer who is going to do your investigation. You meet with him. They ask you many more questions about your background in addition to what was written in your application. You then have the order may be off a little bit now, but you had a psychological evaluation, that you went to a psychiatrist and they asked you a bunch of questions. There was a polygraph that you had to sit through. And then you had to meet with the background officer probably again. You then had an oral board with about 6, anywhere from 3 to 6 senior officers or lieutenants and captains and sergeants who would be on the other side of a table asking you a whole bunch of questions and put you in scenarios and ask you, if this happened, what would you do? If you caught your partner stealing, what would you do? If you got in a shooting and you saw your primary officer throw down a gun next to the body after you killed him, what would you do? And they would say, "Oh, really? You would do that?" And they would begin to question you and give you some pushback on your answers. And then they would bring you back in and go through your background again, and then finally, eventually, maybe you would get hired. I went through that process with LAPD, LA County Sheriff, Anaheim Police Department, Fullerton Police Department, Huntington Beach Police Department, Santa Ana Police Department. I went through a whole bunch of police departments. I got hired by both LAPD and Anaheim at the same time. But that was, and so I went through a whole bunch of the background. All of them were very, very similar. And then the thing that's important for you to understand is that the idea at the time was to weed out the weak, weed out people that did not belong in law enforcement. You could not even have done smoked marijuana back when I applied in 1983 to 84. Maybe it was 82 to 84, somewhere between 1982 and 84. When I applied, you could not have even smoked marijuana. You could not obviously have taken cocaine or heroin, methamphetamine. You couldn't have any arrests. And so your background had to be very clean. And yet they were still had lines around the police department when there were openings in the police department. The idea was to weed out those people that could not hack law enforcement, who had a criminal history, who had any narcotics use in their background. No one could get into law enforcement, at least the departments I was applying for, which again was LAPD, LASO, Anaheim Police Department, Santa Ana. You could not have any history of any criminality, at least that you've been caught for. And then the polygraph would catch you if you had done something but didn't get caught, right? That they would ask you, did you ever steal anything and never got caught? Did you ever drive while you were drunk? Did you ever smoke marijuana, even though you may not have been arrested for marijuana? And the idea, and this is super, super important, is that the idea was to make sure and not hire people that were criminals, weak-minded, could not get through the process because it was too stressful. It's a very stressful period of time as you're going through all these tests, and they purposefully make it hard because they want to make sure that the people that get through are strong-minded and have the fortitude to push through all the negative things that you will be that will come in your way as you're trying to get hired on. Because I'm telling you, there were many times that I got yelled at. I got told to leave the office because they said I was lying. And then they would call me back and say, okay, we want you to come back in. And there were many mind games that they would play, at least with me. You may not have, if you're law enforcement, you may not have had this experience, but I'm telling you, it was not that easy. They had me go in Anaheim, take me three different polygraphs with 3 different polygraphers, because they kept saying, well, you know that guy, or you must be friends with him, because there's no reason you should have passed that first one. And they made me go to the second one. And the second one, they said, well, you may know that guy too. So they made me go to a third one at another police department, the Brea Police Department. I had to go there to get my third polygraph. And I passed all 3 of them and ended up getting hired at Anaheim Police Department. So it was difficult. It wasn't easy to get hired. All right, I'm going to fast forward through the police academy. So you finally get hired, you make it through that. And now the police academy was very similar, that the police department was, the academy was another phase where was it not only the job of the academy to make sure and educate you and prepare you for work in the streets. The other side of the police academy was to get you out of, to push you out, to put so much pressure. They would cuss at us and yell at us and throw stuff at us and tell us to leave. And you don't belong here, that you're weak. And they would put you in the push-up position. You would have to, I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds of push-ups because of I laughed a lot and I giggled because they would get in my face and they would be like inches away from my face, yelling and screaming at me about nonsense, about, do you like boys? And are you are you a mama's boy? And who ironed your shirt for you? And what'd you shine your shoes with? A Hershey bar? And they would be right just inches away. And for me, that makes me laugh. And other people, there were men that would cry. There were men that would pass out. They would have you standing at attention in the heat for many, I don't want to say hours, but for a very long period of time where you could not move, but you had to stand at attention with your hands at the side of your legs along the seams of your pants while they yelled and screamed at you and left you in that standing position. And then if you didn't answer a question the way that they wanted you to, which sometimes there was no right answer, and they would put you in the push-up position and then not allow you to get up. You had to ask for permission to get up. And this went on every day for 6 months. And they kept you until 8 o'clock at night sometimes, and you had to be back at 6 o'clock in the morning. And in that time between 8 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, they had usually given you about 4 or 5 reports to write, where I had to write. I used to not like to cut my hair too short. And so I wrote a lot of reports on the length of my hair, to the fact that I had a string hanging from my shirt and I had to write a 10-page report on why it's important not to have a string hanging from your shirt, to a 10-page report on the history of the coiffeur and of the barber, but it had to be entitled the coiffeur, the history of the coiffeur. And I remember that distinctly because that was quite a lengthy report that I had to write. And remember, at the time, we did not have Google. I had to go to the library. So between 8 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, I had to find the history of the coiffeur and write a 10-page report on it. And again, the purpose is to weed out, at that time, was to weed out people that would not make it. We started with somewhere near, I think, 60 people in our police academy, and 30 people graduated. And I think that's really an important aspect at the time, to get people weeded out. I promise you, this has a point in regard to Uvalde. I promise you. And so that process happens. As I began to have my my experience grow in law enforcement, and I began to train police officers, canine handlers, I began to get invited to teach at police academies. And as I would go now to the academy as a seasoned veteran after 10, 15, 20 years, and would be at the police academy, I began to notice a difference, that they weren't yelling at the people like they used to. They used to have them out by 5 o'clock. They could not be released any later than 5 o'clock. There was no more standing at attention for long periods of time. They couldn't give them a bunch of work to do after hours, because what ended up happening, it was shortly after my academy, some people sued and said, we're working 60, 70, 80 hours, which is true, a week, and only getting paid for 40 hours, which I thought that was normal. I never thought to sue. I just thought, well, this is a great way to make sure that somebody can do the job. And I understood the pressure that they were putting on us, and why it was important for them to put that pressure on us and to make us work extra hard in lack of sleep, and to be able to make decisions, shoot, no shoot decisions at the range, how to drive fast with little sleep, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And then at the same time giving us spelling tests and a whole bunch of penal codes to memorize, and California vehicle codes to memorize, and you name it, just a whole bunch of other things that they made us do. And we saw the importance. Many of us saw the importance. But when people began to sue and say, you can't keep us past 40 hours, and I'm going, what do you mean? Of course they can. It's important. And they won. And so what ended up happening is, no longer could they yell and scream. No longer could they keep you past hours. No longer could they give you work to do and not pay you for it. That if they gave you anything to do, that you could turn in an overtime slip and get paid for overtime. Of course, the department said, well, no, we're not paying you overtime to do a report on the coiffeur. We're not giving you overtime for doing a report on why there's a string on your shirt that's hanging there. So they ordered the academies to stop doing things like that. And so now that aspect of weeding out the weak became reduced as a reason for a police academy. The police academy only became an educational aspect of the process of becoming a police officer, and no longer really is it one of the things that they use in a stressful manner. Academically, they could still fail you, and maybe for not showing up on time and that kind of stuff, but no longer did they necessarily test you for your fortitude to be able to handle the stress of lack of sleep, of putting pressure on you by yelling at you and calling you names and telling you that you're a piece of crap, that you're less than an amoeba. All these things were pretty normal. And that now became less of an opportunity to weed out somebody that should not be in law enforcement. So that began to change. Then after that, the next phase is once you get through the academy, you're now in the FTO program, where you're now placed with about 4 to 6 other veteran police officers, and you spend a series of weeks with each one of these officers. And each period of time that you're with somebody, you're going to a next phase. The first phase is where you're just riding with another police officer and he's telling you and showing you what it is to do. The next one is that you're now having to demonstrate the ability to make a car stop or to make a decision or to write a report. And then the third phase is now you begin to do much more difficult work, like you begin to handle robberies and rapes and assault with a deadly weapon kind of cases. And you are the primary officer with the help of the officer that you're riding with. And then say phase 4 or 5 is where now you begin to do more with less help from the backup officer or the training officer. And then phase 5 or 6, whatever it is then your time to do it. And now the officer that you normally ride with is in plain clothes and supposed to be invisible and essentially only going to help you out when necessary. Sorry, something's happening here on my computer. I had to stop it. It's dictating, taking dictation. Sorry, somehow I said the word Siri. And oh, no, stop it. And so now the FTO program, again, at the time, the FTO program was to weed out the weak, to put pressure on you. I remember him driving me around sometimes at a very high rate of speed, yelling at me, calling me names. And then he'd pull into an alley and say, okay, where are we? And I had no idea that question was coming. And then if I didn't know where we were, that would then mark me down. And there's a great possibility if that continued where I didn't know where we were after him driving in circles and up and down alleys and around corners and then yelling at me and calling me names while he's doing it. And then I'm not able to say I'm at Anaheim and Lincoln, or I'm at State College and Ball, or I'm at, some weird street, Elm and First Street. That would at some point become a concern. And they would say, you know what, this officer can't handle the stress and he may not make it. And again, the FTO program was the next phase to weed people out. So and the reason I'm telling you this is you can see back in the day, you had the hiring process, the academy, the FTO program. Then you have your probationary period where you have all these opportunities as a police department to get rid of people that don't have the ability to handle stress, that are weak-minded, that are weak in their education, that can maintain a memory of what it is they're supposed to do and not do, to make sound decisions under stressful situations where you're one call, you're involved in a shooting, you leave that call, now you're involved in a domestic violence call, you leave that call, then you're on to a carjacking. You're from that call, you're on to a rape where you're dealing with a victim or a child that's been raped or molested. And now you have to take everything that stressed you out about the shooting and the domestic violence and now be able to sit down with a child and talk to them about the molestation. And if you don't have the ability to go from one situation to the next, and you've not been tested enough to make it through there, you will never make it as a police officer. It will be very difficult and you will make bad decisions and you will not be able to go to the next situation and make a decision based on where that call is, not where you are mentally. Remember, the most important thing is that when you're on each one of the calls, that you're responding verbally and physically and in your decision making based on what's necessary for that moment with that person, whether it's a victim or a suspect, not based on what you just dealt with in the crime before you got there, the situation before you got there. And you have to have that ability to shut off what it is you just experienced and turn on a whole new part of you that can deal with a situation differently than when you have just got done wrestling with somebody and fighting with somebody, and now you're coddling somebody or holding somebody, and you're on one knee talking to a child, or you're sitting there with them, giving them a drink and trying to talk to them in a manner where they're going to feel comfortable with you. Or make a decision that maybe, you know what, I can't do this right now. Maybe I do need to call somebody else. Maybe this female victim would be better off with a female officer. And to be able to make those decisions and not be responding based on your feelings because you're still stressed out about what happened at the other call. On top of what's happening to you personally. You could have had a fight with your wife before you went to work. You could have had to deal with something with one of your children before you got to work. And so there's it's very important to make sure that in this process of the hiring process, the academy, the FTO program, that you're pushing somebody to their limits to make sure that when it comes time that person you have hired and you've trained and you've put in this position, that they can actually deal with the stresses of what happens on a daily basis as a law enforcement officer. All right. So I hope all that made sense. And I'm going to hopefully bring it all together so you understand why I talk about all those things. Why I talk about what happened in Uvalde is a much more difficult thing to come to a conclusion as to why what happened. But these are some of the things that we're going to have to come back to give you an idea of why we are where we are and why what happened at Uvalde happened there. All right. So that's how it works with a law enforcement officer. So sorry. I can't get rid of this frog in my throat. Okay. So Amy Phelps really quick says the Officer Tatum, I guess, show is doing an excellent job discussing the story from a perspective that's completely different from anything the media is saying. Oh, I need to watch that. Thank you. And Amy Phelps, what is Officer Tatum, please? And if you could maybe put a link, Amy, for his podcast or whatever show it is you're watching. Nobody would know better than you, bro. Oh, thank you, Eric, for giving me that bit of support. All right. So I know I've lost a bunch of people that were watching earlier, and I know, but because I don't know that it's that interesting, the things that I just talked about, but it's important. It really is important as we get to where we're going to be with Uvalde. I promise you that all of it, you're going to, some people may say, whatever your experience is, that's not, what's happening. Listen, I've trained police officers. I've investigated officers, and I have 2 cases in Texas right now. I've just finished a case in Maine. I have 2 cases in Idaho. I have another case in Maine. I have a case in South Carolina. I'm telling you, I'm dealing with big departments, small departments. And I look at what is happening in these departments through the reports that they write, through the videos that I watch, and through my entire investigation of not only the officers that are involved, but this supervision that's involved and what it is they do and they don't do. So I promise you, all this is important, and all of it is a symptom of what cancer is infecting all these police departments, big and small, but in particular the small ones. So, I just want to go to my notes. Okay, so the probationary period from the process went. So here I have a note for myself that the experience of the process went from weeding out the weak, lame, untrainable, fearful, and soft candidates to find ways to not lose candidates. What happens when you have a very strict hiring process where you don't hire people that have done narcotics, where you don't hire people that have any kind of criminal background, where you don't hire people that their neighbors don't speak badly of, when you don't hire people that, again, it used to be important to be, I forgot this one, and I just remembered it. It was important that a candidate live on his own back in the day when I got hired. If they were still living with mom and dad, they most commonly did not get hired. They had to show that they went to the military for a while or they lived in a dorm for a little while. But if they still lived at home with mommy and daddy, they would also not get hired by the police department. So if you don't have life experience that allows you to understand what people in a domestic violence might be going, can you imagine a 23-year-old or a 24-year-old man who is a police officer comes to a domestic violence call where a man and woman are fighting about finances or about his narcissism or about what's happening between them and the children, and a 24-year-old police officer comes in there, and another 24-year-old, say 24, 26-year-old, 20-something police officers come in there who have never lived on their own, are now going to come into a home where 2 people living together are combating physically and verbally, and a 20-something-year-old, 2 of them are going to come in there and try to have a discussion with 2 people that have life experience. Yet the police officers that are there to try to solve the problem or help them solve the problem, because that really is the job of the law enforcement officers, to come in to try to solve, not take people to jail. The thing that we're trying to do when we come into domestic violence is trying to solve the problem so they don't kill each other. And the hope is that we can get them to go to their corners and hopefully talk one of them into leaving so that cooler minds will prevail on the following day or when somebody sobers up, right? And so that is our job. When we come into a domestic violence, it is not to take somebody to jail. It is really to try to take what is happening in this environment and make some sound decisions and understand, and to put themselves in a position where they can say, you know what, I understand what you're saying. I know. And sometimes we use our own experience to help us solve certain problems. And if you don't have experience, how can you fall back on your own experience to try to solve a problem? And so really, really important to understand that when I'm talking about these things, about life experience, about weeding out people that don't have any business being law enforcement officers at all or not yet. At all or not yet. Some guys and gals would make great police officers. It's just not yet, because they've not been out in the world. They don't know what it's like to live on their own. They don't know what it's like to actually be in a physical fight. They don't know what it's like to be in an argument with a girlfriend, much less a wife. And they don't have the capacity to understand, okay, this is something that I understand. I know exactly what's happening here. And putting yourself in their shoes, if you don't have that experience, it's very difficult to be a police officer. I am telling you, because not every call you go on is to take somebody to jail. It's to solve a problem temporarily. It's to reduce the stress temporarily. It is to try to make some decisions that will help these people go on with their life, hopefully, and not divorce, really, truthfully, or help neighbors get along, or help a party of people that are being obnoxious to not be so obnoxious. These things take life experience and take people that know how to make these sound decisions based on what it is that they know from what's gone on in their life. All right. So the experience and the process of weeding out the weak has gone out the window. And now what's happened, at least what my experience was and still is to this day, it's how to keep candidates. It's actually how to hire. They can't hire anybody because they can't find people that have not done drugs. They can't find people that have been arrested in their life. And so now it is turned upside down. The academy is, how do we make this person work out? Okay, they're not great. They can't make great decisions, but man, he can hit a target. Or he can't hit a target, but he makes some sound decisions. And these things now that used to be a way to weed out people and candidates is now, how is it that we can keep them? And how is it that we keep, especially women and minorities that really maybe should not be in law enforcement, or even the white guy, how he maybe should not be in law enforcement, but how is it that we make it possible so that we can keep him, because we don't have enough people on the streets as it is. And so now it has turned itself upside down. So that is the problem where we're at now, is that the academies, the FTO programs, the probationary periods, the hiring process has now turned upside down on its head. And now we have people getting in law enforcement that quite possibly are very, very good, but we have a large number of them that were carried and pushed through and said, they close it. Okay, I hope he doesn't kill somebody. I've heard that said. I hope he doesn't hurt somebody. I hope she doesn't get somebody killed. But we're going to try to make this work. All right, so we have that. So let me go now through the recent incidences that has changed law enforcement over the years. And I can go all the way back, of course, to 1984 to the 2000s. And we have the pre-Rodney King. Pre-Rodney King was with my heyday as a law enforcement officer. We were arresting bad guys like crazy. We were chasing people up and down the 5 freeway, the 91 freeway. We were chasing them down to the Mexican border. We were chasing them up into Los Angeles and beyond. We were chasing them nearly to Las Vegas. We were having a blast arresting bad guys. There were shootings that were occurring. Some of the neighborhoods of Anaheim that were they had couches that were in the middle of the streets on fire. They had turned cars upside down. It was fun. And supervisors rarely showed up to our calls. If we had a gun battle happen on the street and we got there and there was a body on the ground, the supervisors rarely showed up. We were handling, as 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, we were handling these calls. Supervisors would radio us and say, hey, do you need me? And we would say, no, I got this. We'd have yellow tape up and everything. And there was not, we had so much experience. We had so much training. We were highly prepared for these situations, and supervisors quite often didn't find it necessary to come and stand over us and make sure that we called the ID tech, that we made sure and interviewed all the witnesses that we could possibly interview, that we made sure and collect the evidence properly, that we did all the things necessary to make sure that this crime could eventually be investigated by a detective and then prosecuted and put through the system so that somebody would go to jail. That it was a very, very good time in law enforcement. But suddenly things began to happen that began to change that. We then had Rodney King in 1991. And a number of other incidents that occurred that brought law enforcement to a place where, we need to have supervisors show up on calls. And that became a little bit, for us that did not have supervision, we got to call a supervisor, really? And then sometimes we would have rifts and things began to change and that kind of stuff. We were able to work it out. I think it just took a little while for us to get used to it. But that was one of the first changes that I noticed, is that we went from a bunch of police officers that could do the job and that were counted on and that they could be counted on by supervision to be able to do the job without not a lot of supervision. That began to change, especially as the hiring requirements began to get lowered. The academy began to change, and now they could not allow some of the newer guys to do their job without supervision. Because again, we had reduced the weeding out of the weak-minded, the decision makers were not being able to make decisions. And so now some of the supervisors had to be there because the people that were being hired and were allowed to process and go through the entire process without being fired were now police officers. So again, Rodney King happened, and then 9/11 happened. 9/11 actually was another good time. It kind of softened everything that happened during Rodney King, and law enforcement was looked at very proudly because of everything that happened, and all the America is great, and the law enforcement officers that had gone up into the tower and unfortunately had lost their lives. It kind of brought us back to a place where people go, you know what? I used to get dinner bought for me all the time and said, you know what? We appreciate what you do. We know that your profession made us really proud, along with the fire department and the fire personnel did some amazing things during 9/11, and it became a really good time. We saw the supervision, the hiring process didn't change. So we still were hiring people that probably should not have been necessarily police officers, but that continued on. And then we had President Trump in 2016 get hired. And why do I bring that up? And it's not because I just want to bring up President Trump. It's because President Trump was very pro law enforcement and very pro first responder, fire and ambulance and all the people that are involved. President Trump was very pro law enforcement. So what happens when we had a president that everybody hated, and if they hated him and whatever he loved, they hated? And this is when we began to see the media and Democrats and far left began to say, you know what? He loves law enforcement, so there must be something bad. And things began to happen. And it was really a time where you began to see that anytime law enforcement shot somebody or got in a foot pursuit and somebody got hurt, that they began to scream and yell about, these officers are hurting people and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And the spotlight began to get really strong on law enforcement, what it was happening and what they were doing and what they weren't doing, and questioning everything that was happening, all the tools that we had, all the military weapons that we were being given by the federal government and we were using very effectively. They began to look at, why is the police officer carrying an AR-15? Why is the police officer carrying an MP5? Why does the police officer have a tank and busting through people's doors? And they began to look at it as this bad thing, that law enforcement should not be looking as the militaristic. Wow, that was hard to say. And so that happened. And then, of course, we had Breonna Taylor in 2020, along with George Floyd in 2020. And that gave them license to just destroy the idea that law enforcement was a proud profession. And on top of now having law enforcement officers that were now being hired and put in these positions and the decision making, it really began to show. The light was on us, on law enforcement. The light began to show some of the weaknesses in law enforcement, and things like Chauvin, the officer that probably should never have been hired, was doing things that he should have never done. And a criminal like George Floyd, who had a life of criminality, was now placed on a pedestal, looked as a hero, while the law enforcement officer that should never been hired now was what all law enforcement was. It wasn't just Chauvin. I think that's how you say his name. It wasn't just him. It was now all of law enforcement had his face on them. And it took a really very quick turn from what we saw in 9/11, 2001 to what it looks like now in 2020, where we are demonized. It didn't take down firemen. It didn't take down ambulance drivers, but law enforcement took the brunt of what was happening between Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Breonna Taylor, as you well know, it was shot and killed when they were doing a no-knock notice warrant, and her boyfriend shot at law enforcement. They returned fire. He was like a coward hiding behind her, or was behind her. And when they returned fire, they shot and killed Breonna Taylor. And so these are some of the things that really began to harm us as far as law enforcement is concerned. So I just want to lay these things out so that you understand that we had a change in our hiring process. We had a change in how the academy was run. We had a change in how the FTO program was now to try to get people to get through the FTO program to get hired. We had a number of incidences that occurred that put the focus on us for a while. And then we had a complete meltdown with what happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a number of other incidents that occurred all at the same time. And we had the lies of the news media. The news media jumped on board, and they began to convince liberals that police officers were out there hunting down Black people and killing them on a daily basis. This was true, that this was happening. I've had many people come to me and said, I understand that police officers are killing a lot of Black guys every day, and they're hunting them down, and which is obviously not true. It is anywhere between, in the studies, that there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 between 2019 and 20. I'm not sure the exact date, so don't hold that for me. 8 unarmed Black suspects were killed with gunfire, but 7 of my research, 7 of the 8 that were killed were violent suspects that were trying to take an officer's gun. They were fighting. They were trying to take the gun for the police officer, or they had some other type of weapon, not a gun. When they say somebody's unarmed, they don't take into consideration that they were taking somebody's gun, another officer's gun, or they had some other type of means, a taser that they fought off or something like that. And so there were a number of incidents that involved Black suspects who were unarmed. They were actually killed, but they were violent. It wasn't that they were hunted down by law enforcement, but news media made it sound like officers, white, Black, Hispanic, were out there hunting down Black men and hunting them down and killing them, which again is not true. Twice as many white unarmed suspects were killed by law enforcement during the same period of time. And so they often forgot to mention that. They too were also violent and were shot, and maybe a couple of them were even shot by accident or as a result of somebody else's actions. All right. So let's see what Shar says. Hey, Andy, nice to see you. Actually, hi, nice to see you, Shar. So many of my friends and family looking to get out of law enforcement or retire early. I'm getting to that. All right. So then what happens after George Floyd is that the lies of law enforcement begin to circulate. The tools are removed. No-knock warrants are taken away as a tool, which are very valuable tools, which actually save lives, not take lives. But people that know nothing about law enforcement, know nothing about police work, were making these decisions to remove things like no-knock warrants. The carotid restraint, which is done every day, hundreds of times a day in every dojo here in the United States, is no longer allowed in law enforcement. A very effective hold that is sometimes the bridge between physical force and deadly force. That middle part could be the carotid hold is now taken away. So now you have to go from physical to death. You take away the ability to control somebody with a carotid hold, no longer available. So it's the exact opposite of what it is. Somebody that knows nothing about law enforcement was trying to do actually harm law enforcement by taking and actually is going to cause more deaths as we go forward without having the carotid restraint available. They call it a chokehold. A chokehold and a carotid restraint are two different things. Vehicle pursuits are no longer allowed in some jurisdictions. Foot pursuits, as we learned recently in Chicago, are no longer allowed. That has been actually happening for over a year now. The military tools and weapons are no longer being given to law enforcement as they once were. You're taking away all these things. You're taking away qualified immunity from law enforcement. Now law enforcement who used to have qualified immunity if they were attempting to do the right thing and somebody was killed, if even a mistake was made in the process of really trying to do the job correctly, the qualified immunity no longer protects a person, a law enforcement officer, from personal lawsuits and arrest. That has been taken away. That is huge. They didn't take away any of the politicians' qualified immunity. They didn't take away any of the judges or any of the other people's qualified DA's qualified immunity. But law enforcement officers, the one that are actually out there doing the work, they take away their qualified immunity. Officers are investigated, fired, and arrested for doing their jobs at a much higher rate than they were before. Criminals are favored over police officers by the media and by the Democrat Party. Bail reform. They have completely taken away bail. That you go in, you sign off on a ticket for using a weapon in a crime, for robbery, and they are released. Criminal laws and punishments are reduced, changed, and no longer charged. And so when we arrest somebody and take them into jail for something that would normally, where they would stay, say that we arrest them on a Friday or a Saturday, they would end up staying there until Monday, because we don't release them, because the crime was such a level that you would not release them until they were taken before a judge. That is no longer a tool to help solve a problem. When it comes to domestic violence, again, sometimes we can get people to go to their corners or go somewhere else, but sometimes the only solution is to arrest one of them or both of them. We've arrested both the husband and the wife, but arresting someone may be the solution. It used to be possible to arrest a man in particular who punched his wife in the face and gave her a black eye or a cut, or she even just had redness on her face from a slap, that we would be able to arrest that man on a Friday night or a Saturday night when many domestic violence incidents occurred, and he would have to stay there, sober up, and he would not be able to get out until Monday. And that would be awesome, because it would solve the problem for her. She'd be able to pack her stuff and leave, or she would be able to, I don't know, go to a friend's house or a neighbor's house or a family member's house, and that would give her time. That's no longer available, which is the case with this suspect who killed the El Monte officers, where he was released right away and not charged with the crimes that he had committed. So all these things begin to happen. So why do I bring all these up in relationship to Uvalde? Because this is an important thing to understand, that when you're taking away the tools that allows you to go out there and do the job of arresting bad guys. Remember what I told you, most police officers, they took the job, or they wanted to get hired on, because they loved putting bad guys away. That's usually the number one thing. I want to arrest criminals, bad guys, take them off the street. I want them to go to jail, and I want them to serve time. And in some cases, it would be great if they were to get their act together, and then when they get out, they no longer commit crimes. That's actually one of the most important things. But I want you to understand that when we get the job, it was initially to arrest people and to take them to jail. The other things I talked about were that the adrenaline rush, to do something different every day, the passion of using my skills of training dogs to use them to catch bad guys, and then the benefits and the ego boost, and all these things are so important. But when you're being demonized on a daily basis, when you no longer can arrest people because that's the reason you took the job, and you now can't do that, when you are now being looked at everything you do, not in how you're doing well, but how it is that they can now ding you or arrest you or fire you or discipline you, when every day you check out that car, you get in that patrol car, and you're going, I'm not going to go do anything. Remember, I told you we wouldn't do something if it caused us more paperwork. If that was enough to get us not to arrest somebody and to do something different, what do you think is going to happen when now you are going to be arrested, or you're going to be disciplined for something you would not have been arrested for, that normally you would have been pat on the back for taking somebody into custody and wrestling with them and saving somebody's life, or taking somebody into custody that was violent, and in the process you broke their arm, but it didn't matter because you took a bad guy off the street. But now all this is turned around and upside down. All the reasons you became a law enforcement officer are now being taken away from you. And now when you hit the street, what is it you're going to do? You're going to think twice. You're going to hesitate. You're going to drive a little bit slower to those calls. You're going to question your decision-making as to, oh my gosh, if I don't make the right decision, what's going to happen to me? It's going now becomes about you. When in the past, you would have said, I don't care what happens to me, because I'm going to go in there and take care of business. I don't care what happens to me, because this is the call that I've been waiting for. This call where we have an active shooter in the school, this is a call I've been waiting for all my career. And I'm going to go in there and I'm going to do my very best. It's like being an athlete. Say you're a hockey player and you have been practicing since you're a little kid, and you practice your stick handling, your passing, your shooting, your wrist shot, your slap shot, your deke. You're doing all these things all your life. You've been working for this one moment in time. And as you become an adult and you actually get selected to play on a professional team, and now You've waited and you go, the Stanley Cup is that one thing that I've always wanted. As a police officer, that one call that you go on there, go out and save somebody's lives, you've been waiting for that call all your life. You want to arrest the guy that's on the TV that's been wanted by 7 counties. You want to go after that guy that's now driving down the road that you got the radio call that the red Corvette is the one that has the bad guy in it with this license plate, and you see it and you get excited. You go, I'm going to catch that guy and he's going to go to jail. You've been waiting for that moment. If you're that athlete, that hockey player, that you finally get that chance, and now there's no time left, the score is tied, and they just make the decision who's going to go out on that ice for the last puck drop. You want it to be you. You want to be the one that goes out there and saves the day, that scores the goal. As a police officer, when you get that call, you want to be the first one through the door to save those lives. But it's all been taken away because of everything that I just described to you. That maybe you weren't the sharpest tool in the shed. Maybe you weren't the bravest. Maybe you weren't the strongest. And now you're already weakened and you're not heavily prepared because they didn't prepare you in the academy, because they didn't want you to quit. They didn't want to yell at you because there were so many people that quit when they got yelled at. There's so many people that quit because they had to work overtime but didn't get paid for it. There were so many people that quit that would have, you know, if you would have yelled at them, make them do push-ups, but they didn't do that to you. They didn't prepare you for that moment. And now they're taking away all your tools. And now they're saying, if you make a wrong decision, we're going to fire you. If you make the wrong decision, we're going to arrest you. If you make the wrong decision, we're going to ruin your life. So now we get to Uvalde. And I took an hour to get to Uvalde. I am so sorry, but an hour, and I told you I was going to try not to do that. But there is no other way to get to what happened to Uvalde without explaining to you all these other things that had to take place to get to this point in Uvalde. A small police department of maybe 30 police officers. A small police department, you have to understand, in the law enforcement world is where many officers, not all, and I know I offend people when I say this, police officers that are at these small police departments, I know, and I'm sorry, but most police officers, when they're trying to get hired, especially those that want to go out there and catch bad guys, try to get hired on at LAPD, LA County Sheriff, San Diego Police Department, possibly Anaheim Police Department, Santa Ana Police Department, New York, right? It used to be where you'd go to these big police, and that's where you try to get hired because also they pay well, especially LAPD, LA County Sheriff, Anaheim, Santa Ana, Newport Beach, Huntington Beach, all these places, by the Irvine PD, they all pay extremely well, probably the highest in the country. And you try to get hired on there first, and you don't make it. At least you used to not make it. And can you imagine what's not making it now, right? If you're not making it there, then where do you go? You go to the smaller police departments, and you go to the next smaller police department. You go to the next until you get hired at the police department that pays a little bit, a little bit, but they have no choice because everybody else trying to get hired at the big departments. And so they settle on, quite often, not always, quite often, the people that have either couldn't make it somewhere else or got fired from the other police departments. True story. And there's another way to tell you about it. But, and again, not all small police departments, because some small police departments, like in LA, like, I don't know, small, like El Monte, for instance, I'm sure they have great police officers because it's in an area where they are constantly active. And if they didn't get trained in the academy, they get trained on the street because you are constantly going to shooting calls, carjackings, robberies, and that kind of stuff. But Uvalde, not so much. They had 2 homicides in the last 9 years. 2 homicides in the last 9 years, and they solved both of them. And so it was probably Jimmy John, got drunk and shot his friend at the lake, and that was pretty easy arrest. But you can't say Uvalde has great experience in dealing with drive-by shootings, carjackings, robberies in progress, high-end pursuits where people are shooting from cars and crashing. You may have pursuits that drive through Uvalde, but you're not dealing with this thing on a daily basis. So when we get to Uvalde on this show, and we're talking about what happened to Uvalde, you got a number of different police departments that also had to come into Uvalde. Why? Because they didn't have the resources that were necessary to take care of what was happening at the school, the elementary school there in Uvalde. And so you had sheriff's departments, you had border patrol, and you had Uvalde. And what happens when you have all these different agencies there is you have bad communication, and you have officers that it's in their city and that is their jurisdiction, and they've never been put in this situation. Number one, an active shooter situation or any kind of shooter situation. Not only that, they're now having these federal agencies and the county there, and they have to now make decisions in order to tell them what to do. As an assisting agency, you take orders from the agency where the incident is occurring. They are in charge. The chief of police, the captain, the lieutenant, the sergeant, and the officers are all in charge of that scene, essentially. And the sheriff's department, the border patrol, are to take orders essentially from the small police department, a small police department that has no experience in this situation. Now, they had, understandably, they have active shooter training at these schools and that kind of stuff. And I got to tell you that it depends on what this active shooter training was involved. What did they do? Who ran it? Who put it together? Was it other officers that don't have a lot of experience in active shooter? That part I have not been able to find out exactly who handled it. Was it mostly PowerPoint presentations? Was it actually putting you in a stressful situation where you had to make a sound decision, or was it a cold walkthrough that they walk through, right? And everybody has orange guns and they say, okay, this is what you're going to do. And this is how you breach the door. This is what we're going to do next. We're going to call into the classroom on the teacher's phone, and we're going to say, hey, can I speak to the active shooter and get him to come out with his hands up? What was involved in this training? Just because you hear that they had active training shooter, it doesn't mean they were prepared for an active shooter. And that is one of the things that is very much in my wheelhouse, is that people hated training with me because I would stress them out. I had police officers cry during a narcotics training scenario. I had officers cry and tell me they don't know what to do in a stressful situation. I put them, which is an active shooter situation that I put them through, where one of the officers that was an actor would actually be shot, not really be shot, but would fall down and act like his femur was broken from the gunshot and screaming, and blood would be coming out. And it was a scenario that I put them through. I had officers that would just quit in the scenario. And this is what is necessary. And this is what I'm questioning, whether they did that kind of training and do that kind of training for these active training sessions. Did they actually put the officers in stressful situations where they had to make a decision under stress, not on a piece of paper? Question number 14, what do you do when you don't have a shield? What do you do when you don't have a radio that works? What do you do when you respond and you hear gunshots? What does you do? Oh, I run in, and you write that down. No, do you really run in? No, I'll write that on the form. No, do you really run in? If I'm shooting at you, if I'm hitting you with paintballs in the face, are you still going to run in? That's what you have to do to these people. And I'm telling you, this stuff is not being done. I would have officers, like I was going to say earlier, and I stopped myself, is that they avoid coming to my training in many cases because they knew that I was going to challenge them, that they actually had to be put in a situation where they had to make a decision that maybe they didn't want to make, where they were going to get hurt, where it was going to hurt by making that decision. And so if we take the type of people that are being hired, if we take the training that they did not get, if we take the idea that they have never been put in this situation before, and now here we have an active shooter. We have gunshots being heard that they've never heard before in their entire life, other than at the range. This is a violent suspect in a classroom with children that are screaming, quite possibly, and gunshots, and they're outside, and now they've got to make a decision. Somebody, a sergeant or a chief of police with no experience, told them to hold up. That's all they needed to hear. When they're told to hold up, they tell the sheriff's department to hold up. They tell the border patrol to hold up because they needed an excuse to hold up. And that seems very much what happened here on this situation, because there's a photograph that I was going to use as a graphic here. And I don't know if I put it up. Let's see if I have it here no, I didn't put it up, where you can find it on the internet, where you can see a photograph that's about 20 minutes, I think, before they actually go in, where there's a shield leaning against the wall, and they had the shield. And that's why I think it is that these officers who weren't really prepared mentally, they weren't they weren't trained and prepared through training. They were not prepared with their decision making. And they are also thinking about, what if I make the wrong decision? Again, we've spent just 3 or 4 years of the media and the Democratic Party demonizing law enforcement and arresting law enforcement for making some pretty simple decisions, and making decisions where they had to use lethal force or attempt to use lethal force that were fired and arrested and taken to jail. And now you have this happening at the time where you have untrained, unprepared officers in a small police department where there was no experience in this ever, even in quite possibly in their training. Now also thinking, wow, what if I make the wrong decision? What if more people are killed if I go in? What if I shoot the wrong person? What if I shoot the teacher? What if I shoot one of the kids by making, what if, and now all this is going on. And the longer they wait, the more it begins to turn into a snowball effect where now they're frozen in their indecision. And what ends up happening is that you have a team of Border Patrol agents who have experience, who are what are considered elite, that just simply said, you know what, we are going in and we're no longer following orders, and we're going to go in there and we're going to take our chances. And and they did, and they finally went in, and not one of them was hurt. Because that's what happens in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases. If you go in tactically and you go in with a plan, you can go in and you can overcome almost any situation. And so this is not going to be the last one. As more information comes, I will do another one of these, and it won't be as long, but there was a lot of foundation that needed to be laid as to why we were in this situation in Uvalde, how we got to this point in Uvalde, where we had officers not going in when they know, and they've been told and they've heard. When we have a history of these school shootings where we changed from standing back and waiting and trying to make contact to running in and going in. We had an incident in Florida where the guy stood outside the door and did not go in while children were being killed. We know law enforcement isn't, it's impossible not to know. It's impossible not to have heard what happened in Florida. It's impossible not to hear what happened in Colorado. It's impossible not to hear what has happened in other situations, because these things are talked about all the time. But it's not until you're put in the situation as a law enforcement officer, until you hear those gunshots, until you hear people screaming for help, until you understand the pressure that you are going to be put under by being put in that situation, that you will have to make a choice. Is it me or is it them? And in law enforcement, it has to be, I will sacrifice myself. I will go in. I will make a decision. I will be the first one through the door. You have to have that attitude that you have been building up and waiting for that opportunity to be the one to go in. And I have to go in and I have to get shot so the next guy can come in and save people's lives. That's just how it works. You want to be the first through the door. It wasn't unusual in our SWAT team there in Anaheim that most of the men, because we only had men on the SWAT team, that most of the men wanted to be the first one through the door. It became an argument of who was going to be the first through the door, not who was going to be the last in the door, who was going to be the first through the door. And there were times where I was first in the door and they didn't like it. They go, no, how come he gets to go first in the door? Because at the time I had the dog, and the dog needed to go in first to possibly find the bad guy and to catch the bad guy. And there was a lot of pushback because I was going to be the first through the door, and people didn't like it. Police officers, men who have been trained and working and preparing themselves and involved in other chases, and they weren't the one who actually was able to cut, they get frustrated. I wanted to be the guy who caught the bad guy. And you're waiting for this moment to happen. These guys in Uvalde were not prepared. They were possibly not hired properly. They were not given the opportunity to understand what their role was, and to be that guy who said, I want to put me in, coach. I want to be the first one through the door. And it's clearly was not what what these officers were prepared for. You can see it. You can hear it in the radio broadcast. Or look, oh, I don't have a radio. Well, we need one more tool. We need the pry tool to open the door. We need all these kinds of things. Nobody even said, hey, you know what I want you to do on the outside, I need you to break the window to the same close classroom we're going to enter. Why? Because we want to distract. We want to divert. We want to divert his attention. We want somebody to drive a car through. Take a car and drive it through the back wall of that classroom as hard as you possibly can. It's not going to go all the way through and run over anybody. But what we want him to think, the bad guy, is that you are going to drive through that door as we're trying to enter through the door to get in so that we can take him out with a shot. None of those things were discussed. Not one time. I've looked to see what other things were they thinking. What were some of the tactics that they thought they were going to deploy? You could go through the front door, but what else were you going to do? Were you going to throw a flashbang? Did anybody have a flashbang? Did anybody have anything else? A rock to throw through the window? None of those things were discussed. They were not prepared. They did not have the instinct that you need as a law enforcement officer to be the first through the door. And it's because of the things that I laid out over the last 30 years, how law enforcement has changed, how the hiring process has changed, how the preparedness for these police officers has changed, how training. All I hear all the time is that we need to put officers through more training. You don't need more training. You need better training. More training. What? There's not enough time to do more training. We have to do CPR training. We have to do woke training. We have to hear about the different genders. We have to hear a bunch of other bullshit that really doesn't matter. And it takes us off of the street. If you are going to take us off to do off the street, you didn't make sure that the training is good, that is sound. You want people to be pressured. You want them to feel pain. You want them to understand what it's like to be put in that position. And if you can't do it, get out. You can't do the job, get out of the job. We have far too many police officers that make it year after year after year that are always on the perimeter, that are always making a car stop on the way to the difficult call. Because why? Because they don't want to be tested. They don't want to be put in that position because they weren't hired properly. They weren't weeded out. And I know that that's hard for some police officers to hear that are listening to me right now, that may hear this broadcast, that there's a great possibility that it's either you or somebody next to you that should not be a police officer because the job of weeding them out was never done. And the preparing them for this type of situation was never done. And these are the things that needed. This is the demise of law enforcement if we don't change these things. We need to go back to the way we used to hire. We need to go back to the way we used to prepare. And we need to go back to a place where training hurts and it's hard and it's difficult. And we make men cry because it's not fun. And this is the things that we need to do, or else we'll have more Uvaldes, we'll have more incidents, and it's not going to get better until we change all of those things. Oh my gosh. All right. And Rose says, Andy, I get the history, but what does it take? Save those kids. Absolutely. They weren't prepared. They weren't ready to save those kids. Those men, and I don't think there were any women. That's why I'm going to use men. Those men were not prepared to go in. The other agents that came in were, but remember what I told you, they hesitated because they were ordered to wait. They wanted to go in, from what I understand. There were a couple of guys, we got to go in. And it was because it was Uvalde Police Department's incident, again, made up of police officers that have never had any experience in this kind of situation. Even though they've had training, they don't have real life experience in this situation, told them to wait, ordered them to wait. And they're going, what do you mean wait? We got to go in. No, we need you to wait. Why? Because I don't have a radio, because I don't have a shield, because I don't have a pry tool, because I don't, blah, 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 blah. And finally, Border Patrol said, we are not waiting and we are going in. And somebody made the decision to go in. And it was against orders. Carl says, I've seen so many officers vapor lock in stressful training. I've even used guys as a human shield when they froze up in the doorway as I pushed them in through the doorway as we were taking sim rounds. Exactly, Carl. Thank you, Carl, for adding to this discussion. Carl Whitty says, absolutely right. The guys who show up when it's code 4, professional. Professional follows. Yes, professional follows. Oh my gosh. Carl brings up something. Carl's a police officer. And yeah, we know. Like Carl would be a guy that I would say, can I get Carl to show up on my call? Could I get, I've named the people before. We got Chuck Knight. We got Chuck Marsalisi. We got Jim Reed. We got Chuck Marsalisi, Chuck Alvarado. I could go on. Mike Lozo, a number of people that I work with that you would see them next to you and you were going in, and you knew you were going to take somebody down, and you knew that it was quite possible one of us was not going to come out, but we knew that whatever happened, that the other guy was going to try to save our lives if we went down. There was no doubt that we were going in. But we also had those officers that you never saw them on a hot call. Never. They were always, I got the perimeter. I got the east perimeter. I got the south perimeter. I got the on-ramp for the freeway. I'm making a car stop on my way to the robbery in progress. Well, you're making a car stop on the way to robbery. What? What do you mean? And so I'm telling you, and that is when hiring was good. That's when training was good, that you still had those officers that never showed up because you knew there were other officers that would. We at Anaheim and Garden Grove and Tustin and Santa Ana and these other people, there was enough officers that you had your core officers that were always the ones that wanted to go in. Coach put me in, and you had enough officers that you needed on the perimeter. And you go, you know what? I can count on him he holds a good perimeter. And he'll let me know if somebody's running, and then I'll have to come out and help him. But you knew those guys. There was a place for everybody in the larger police departments. When you get in the smaller police department, it's not as easy to hide. And at some point, you may be put in a position that you were never prepared for and you never wanted to be in. And that's when it's going to show. It's going to show at a place like Uvalde. The answer, I'm sorry, who asked that question? Rose. The answer, Rose, to what does it take? We need to go back to hiring capable people. We need to go back to having stressful, difficult police academies. We need to go back to stressful training, difficult training where you get hit with a round, with the sim round, like Carl said. You need to get hit in the face a couple times, in the groin. On occasion, you need to get hurt, and you'll be out for a couple weeks. But once a couple of people get hurt, and it was during nunchuck training. I remember during nunchuck training, some people had their shoulders dislocated, fingers dislocated, broken wrists, and they stopped. They said, well, we can't do this anymore because people are getting hurt. And I go, what do you mean you're stopping because people get hurt? That's what needs to happen is you need to get hurt. And we need to support our law enforcement. Thank you. And we need to go back to supporting our police. Absolutely, Rose. We need to go back to supporting police, give them back their tools that they need to do the job. All right. I know this was a lot of information leading up to a small portion on Uvalde, but it's all because of the bigger portion that we got to Uvalde. And it cost children their lives and teachers their lives. And there's a lot of blame that goes around. And it's not just one faceted, it's multifaceted. All right, my friends, thank you for sticking through this. Those of you that stuck around the entire time, I appreciate it. And we will see you on the next one. All right, my friends, take care. Talk to you later. And where is my video? There it is. Okay, bye.